Alrighty, so Psyker is the highest skill cap character in the game. You are the squishiest character in the game by a sizable margin. Not just that, but you have to know how to use your brain burst properly, you have to know what weapons to use when, and of course the whole warp charge mechanic kind of encourages some not so good gameplay out of the player. So with this video, I want to clear all of that up and give you guys a strategy guide on how to play the Psyker in game. Now, I don't necessarily want to go all in on a build guide just yet, just because we don't have the crafting system. And so none of us can really reliably get the right blessings or the right perks. Right now, it's all just reliant on RNG. So we will wait until the crafting system is finished to do any build guides. But without further ado, let's get into the guide. So when it comes to picking your melee weapon, I would suggest really just trying them all out and see which one feels best to you. The main ones I have been running are the Force Sword, the Tactical Axe, and the Dueling Sword. So to use a Dueling Sword, most of the time you're just going to be spamming lights, and you're going to stagger and do a lot of damage to a horde. And once these flak armor enemies come up to you, you want to aim for the head and do your heavies. And they're very powerful heavies if you hit them in the head. So for the Tactical Axe, it's very similar. You'll notice that the light attacks don't have as much cleave. Also notably, the push attack is very good too on the Tactical Axe. So make sure you're throwing push attacks in there. And then of course, when the armored enemies show up, you just do your heavies. And the Force Sword is the only one of these weapons that actually has a combo. And that combo is light, heavy, light, light, heavy, light, light, heavy. The rhythm is kind of odd. I like to think of the combo actually starting with the heavy and the first light being like a pickup into that. So again, that's light, heavy, light, light, heavy, light, light, heavy, light, light, heavy. And you need to be doing this while you're fighting a horde. If you try to attack a horde just by spamming lights, you're not going to be getting a whole lot accomplished. Technically, the optimal combo would just be a light and then a heavy and then a reset, like so. But honestly, I don't mind the last light being in there because it's really fast and it makes the rhythm of the combo feel much more smoother. Also, you should keep in mind that the push and the push attack for the Force Sword are very good. It's very wide and has a lot of stagger. And for the flak armor enemies, I would go with heavy, light, light. That's going to get that overhead in there. And when the big boys start to show up, you use your weapon special. Vermintide players will feel very at home using the Force Sword, mostly because there are actual combos that you need to be using. It's not a just spam light or spam heavies kind of weapon. Now, for the ranged weapons, I'm just going to talk about the staffs. If you like using a gun on the Psyker, go for it. Totally viable, I just like the staffs. And each staff has its own niche. The Surge Staff is a ranged CC weapon. As far as I know, it's the only weapon in the game that can actually stun a mutant out of its charge. So that alone just makes the Surge Staff absolutely invaluable. So that means it can also stun a group of Ogrins, it can stun a Poxhound, it can stun a Bomber, stuns Bursters. Yeah, you get the gist. The only time it will actually do a notable amount of damage is when you're hitting flak armored enemies. And we can clearly see that here on the chart. And you'll also notice that it does the same amount to Carapace armored enemies. The thing is, Carapace armored enemies have a ton of HP. And you'll notice that a full charge will kill 2 scabs at a time. So it's very good in mid-range engagements, and also at stunning groups of elites and stunning specials. The Void Strike Staff is your option for just raw damage. It's great at horde clear, it's great at killing ranged enemies, it will stun most enemies. So yeah, there's honestly not a whole lot to say about the Void Strike Staff. It's very straightforward, it does a lot of damage, it annihilates hordes, and annihilates ranged enemies. If that's what you're looking for, just raw damage, definitely go with the Void Strike Staff. And the Flame Staff, why is it called that? This is your crowd control staff. A full charge with this can actually solo an entire horde. And unlike in Vermintide, this staff is actually very, very good in this game. Because I think you're actually incentivized to keep hordes at an arm's length in this game more than you are in Vermintide. We're not relying on hordes to give us temp HP like we are in Vermintide. And also, this weapon's very good at suppressing ranged enemies. And if you happen to get the jump on a group of ranged enemies, you can annihilate them with one full charge. And I would also encourage you to hop in the meat grinder and experiment with the range on the staff. The range extends from where I'm standing to where that first flak armored enemy is. So to demonstrate, see there, and I'm not hitting the second enemy. So yeah, the flame staff is for soloing hordes and suppressing ranged enemies in mid-range engagements. And its damage to heavy units should not be underestimated. And even further, it has some really good synergy with some of the feats the Psyker has. We'll get more into that here in a minute. And so lastly, we have the Trauma Force Staff. And there's a reason I saved this one for last, and that's because while the other three excel in a certain area, the Trauma Force Staff does what they all do, but not as well as any of them. So what do I mean? The Trauma Staff is an all-rounder. So it's great at horde control, but it's not as good as the Flame Staff. It is good for staggering elites, but is not as good as the Surge Staff. And it has good damage, but the damage isn't as good as the Void Strike Staff. And when I say it like that, you might be thinking that I think this is a bad weapon. The truth is quite the contrary. Since it's an all-rounder, you have an answer to most situations. But you won't be doing crazy things like soloing a horde, stunning a mutant out of its charge, or one-shotting a group of ranged enemies. Though it does need to be said that this weapon can work against you and that you can be knocking enemies into your team or behind your team, know that it is your responsibility to kill those enemies that you knocked into your team. But yeah, the Trauma Force Staff is the jack of all trades, master of none, which is good in some cases and not so good in other cases. Now we also need to talk about the Brain Burst. My view on the Brain Burst is that you should not be spamming your Brain Burst. One, it's not fun, and two, your time is probably better spent doing other things, with the exception of taking out a few specific specials. So, for reference, you can one-shot a sniper, a trapper, a bomber, a shotgunner, and lastly, either of the gunners. So if you see any of those specials and nobody is killing them, that is the time to bring out your Brain Burst. Additionally, if you're fighting a bulwark in a close corridor where your team can't really get a flank on them, it's also a good idea to Brain Burst the bulwark. But if you're running the Surge Staff or the Trauma Staff, then it's probably better to use your right click and CC the bulwark. Similar logic for a Crusher and a Mauler. And you might be thinking, well, if I'm not spamming my Brain Burst, then how am I going to get my warp charges? And my friend, I have an answer for you. This is the kind of like default talent build I have been running, and you'll want to notice that we take Psychic Communion. So anytime somebody kills something in your coherency, you have a 4% chance to get a warp charge. And we also take Kinetic Flare, so all of your attacks have a 10% chance to trigger Brain Burst, usually resulting in a warp charge. And that's got a cooldown of 15 seconds. Paired with using the Brain Burst very sparsely, that is usually enough to keep 4 stacks of warp charges throughout most of the mission. And while the extra 12% damage is nice to have, it's not an absolute necessity. This does not help you reach any breakpoints that I know of, though I would almost put money on that changing. But for now, I think we treat warp charges as nice to have, but not an absolute necessity. Now, if you are using a staff, do not take Mind in Motion. If you have a staff and you have high peril, so let's just say we have our Brain Burst out, we can just switch to our staff and we can quell, and it's not quite full move speed, but it is just a little bit slower than that. So do yourself a favor and pick up the extra tankiness from Kinetic Shield. So now let's talk about the feat build for the Flame Staff. And it's not too different, but you do want to take Ascendant Blaze. Reason being, it gives you a 10% chance to get a warp charge when something is killed with Soul Blaze. And you should take note that the Flame Staff procs Kinetic Slayer basically on cooldown because of how many ticks of damage it's doing per second. And that extra 10% from Ascendant Blaze allows us to get rid of Psychic Communion and take Cerebral Lacerations. An extra 15% damage from all sources that are not warp sources is absolutely huge for killing bosses. And not just bosses, things like big elites too. So just to recap on these kind of general guidelines on the feats, using the Surge Staff, the Trauma Force Staff, the Void Strike Staff, your build should look like this. And if you're using the Flame Staff, then it should look something like this. Again, general guidelines. We don't have our hands on the crafting system, so we don't really know what breakpoints look like or what it's going to take to get those breakpoints and whatnot. All very liable to change. So now let's get into the in-game strategy for the Psyker. And the first thing we need to talk about is positioning. There are two things you need to have in mind at all times while you're playing the Psyker. That is, where's my team and where's the nearest cover? If you have an Ogren on your team, you basically want to be next to them all of the time. Reason being, you are very squishy and the Ogren is very tanky and you can help each other out. And if you're lucky, the Ogren will be running the feat that gives you 100% replenishment on your toughness. And you basically don't ever want to be running out in the open, and you always need to know where the nearest cover is, because the second bullets start flying, that's where you're going to be going. Basic game loop is you charge your staff while you're in cover, and then you pop your head out to do your attack, and then you go back into cover and you charge your attack, and so on. And it's vice versa for the brain burst. You pop your head out to target the brain burst, and then once it's charging, you can break line of sight, it will keep on the target, and you can get into cover. If you play like that 100% of the time, you should really not be taking much damage at all. And that's mainly for ranged engagements. So let's talk about melee engagements. You need to master defensive melee combat on the Psyker. So the way I do this is kind of getting into a rhythm. I would encourage you to hop in the meat grinder and just sit there and dash with different intervals and kind of figure out where your efficient dodges stop. So let me get out a weapon that actually has decent dodge distance. You can do your weapon inspection to see what your dodge limit is and your dodge distance. If you don't know, your dodge limit is how many dashes you can spam in a row. So the tactical axe has a dodge limit of 5. So that means I can dodge 5 times, one right after the other. And then after those 5 dodges, my dodges are progressively going to get shorter and shorter and shorter. So what you want to do is find a rhythm where you're dodging after the dodge timer resets. Okay, and that was a lot of word salad, so let me explain what I mean. So I just sit here and I spam my dodge. After 5 dodges, my dodges will start to get really comically short. So we want to space out our dodges. I like to do mine every second or so. Now, obviously, there's more to melee combat than just dodging. So then, while you're doing that dodging, you start working in your horde clear combo. Okay, and for the tactical axe, that's really just lights. But see, this is not enough to be good at defensive combat. You also want to start throwing in pushes or push attacks. Now the tactical axe has a very good push attack, so we'll do that. So we start with our dodges, okay? Then we're doing our horde clear combo, which is just lights. Then we start throwing in our push attack. And if you do this, it's going to be pretty hard for the enemies to hit you, but you do always want to keep an eye on your stamina. If it gets to 0, then you're going to start to run into problems. So yeah, that is the gist of not just defensive melee combat, but really just melee combat in general. That's something you need to master on the Psyker because you are so squishy. Okay, so now you're bouncing in and out of cover, you're dodge dancing like a master. So now the question is, what do you hit? What do you aim for? What weapon do you use for which enemies? And of course, that depends on the weapons you're using. So let's start with the Surge Staff. If you're using the Surge Staff, if you see any of the Flak Armored enemies, you're gonna want to hit those with your lightning. You do bonus damage to them with the Surge Staff, and it's going to stun a bunch of the ranged enemies around them. If you get stuck in a close quarters combat, you definitely want to bring out your melee weapon, of course. But if you start to get swarmed by elites, like Ragers or a bunch of Ogrins or Maulers, or maybe all of the above, that's when you dodge back, you get behind your front line, so you get behind your Ogren and your Zealot, and you start to shoot those elites with lightning, because that's going to CC them and allow your team to put in the work and kill them. And if you see any specials, okay, specials are your highest priority target, especially with the Surge Staff. If the special is one of the enemies I mentioned earlier that a brain burst can one-shot, then you hit G and paint the walls with their brains. But pay attention, because if your veteran is also shooting that special, he's going to kill it way before you can brain burst it. Now, if you see a flamer or a mutant or a hound, you also bring out the Surge Staff and you stun those again so your team can kill them. Trust me, if you are running the Surge Staff, do not try to brain burst mutants or any enemies that you cannot one-shot, because the Surge Staff is going to work much better. It's going to disable that special from actually doing anything. And even if your team isn't paying attention, worst case scenario, you just have to throw a few charges at it and then you will eventually kill it. Now the Trauma Staff is actually very similar to the Surge Staff. Most of what I just said also applies to the Trauma Staff, with the exception of what I said about mutants and flamers and so on. If you're using the Trauma Staff and you see a flamer or something you can't one shot with your brain burst, it's better to use your right click on them to knock them down and then brain burst them. Usually that will kill the special. Though if you see a mutant, just run for your life, honestly. And also with the trauma staff, it's not a bad idea when the horde gets really dense to back up and get behind your front line and start right clicking the horde. I wouldn't do this all the time. I would just do it when the horde gets really dense, because it's going to knock a lot of those enemies around, and if there's not a lot of them, then that can make the engagement really messy. But generally the approach with hordes on the trauma staff is to right click the horde and then use your melee weapon for cleanup. The Void Strike staff is fairly simple. You pretty much just shoot everything with it. It's gonna kill ranged enemies. It's gonna kill hordes. It will do okay against armored enemies. With the Void Strike staff, it might actually be better to use your Brain Burst against heavily armored enemies. Again, the Void Strike staff is fairly straightforward. Now the Flame Staff is probably the most different in terms of in-game use. You want to be charging your staff and cooking the horde alive. Like I said earlier, you can completely solo an entire horde with the Flamestorm staff. Notice how it staggers most of the things it hits. So even if the horde is in your face, if you're hitting all of them with your fire, then you're not going to get hit. But keep in mind, you can also dodge while you're channeling that fire. The Flame Staff is actually going to do a lot of damage too to groups of elites, but just keep in mind it's not going to stagger them. So again, you're going to want to be with your frontliner for that one. And really, we're just using our melee weapon for cleanup when we're using the Flame Staff. Now for ranged engagements, you want to find a way to get close enough to the ranged enemies to shoot your fire at them, not necessarily to kill them, but to suppress them. Again, remember the range is longer than it seems, and you really want to make use of that. If everything is really far away, then you duck and cover and pull out the Brain Burst. I think the main downfall of the Flame Staff is that it's not good at dealing with specials. So you're also gonna have to use your Brain Burst for killing any specials that you see. And again, if you see a mutant, just run for your life. So yeah, if you can't tell, a lot of the skill cap with the Psyker is actually knowing what weapon to use when and kind of how to navigate the map. If you ever have any doubts about what you're doing, stay next to your Ogryn and kill the things that your weapons are good at killing. And I highly recommend looking at the weapon inspection for the weapon you're using before you get into the game, so you actually know what they're good at killing. So yeah, as a Psyker, you are very squishy, you are not necessarily easy to play, and you have a lot of decisions that you need to be making on the fly. And that's really the crux of playing the Psyker, is making the right decisions for the situation that you are in. And hopefully this guide has given you at least a start in understanding what you should be doing in different situations. Again, the stuff for the builds in this video are not necessarily final. We will be doing a video dedicated specifically to builds for the Psyker when the crafting system is finished and I've had enough time to actually play with the different blessings and the different perks, because I want to get you guys good information and information that's going to last. Be on the lookout for that when the crafting system finishes, hopefully within a couple months. I have no idea. Apparently they're going to just release a small part of it sometime in the near future, and I don't know what they're doing. But yeah, I appreciate you spending your time watching, listening to me talk about Darktide. If you like the video, give it a like, subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.